Czechoslovakia had been a communist country under the USSR's sphere of influence from shortly after the end of the Second World War. While life in Czechoslovakia had been optimistic in the aftermath of the Nazi occupation, after Antonín Novotný took power as first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in 1953, which was the de facto head of government, the quality of life began to deteriorate, and by 1968 the Czech people were at their limit. Although the Soviet Union had begun a process of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev in 1956, Novotný was slow to follow, being pro-Stalinist himself. Notoriously, he kept many political prisoners jailed for several years after Stalin's regime had ended. His strict policies of press censorship and restrictions on individual freedoms made him a very unpopular leader. Owing to both Stalin's 5-year plan and Comecon, Czechoslovakia saw an increased focus on industrial production, such as mining and steel manufacture. As a result, the economy grew by as much as 170% by 1957, although this was relatively low compared to Western countries such as West Germany, whose economy grew by 300% in the same time. This was no doubt aided by the 1948 Marshall Plan, in which the US funded the economy of many Western countries after World War II. Unfortunately, this put a strain on the Czechoslovak workers and did not increase productivity, which ultimately led to a fall in national income starting in the early 1960s. Despite Novotný attempting to counter this with the 1965 new economic model, it had little effect and only gave him a worse image. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev visited the country in December 1967 to see Novotný facing protests from students and being challenged by the Slovak statesman Alexander Dubček. He removed Novotný in favour of Dubček, who quickly appealed to the needs of the people. He promised long-awaited reforms such as relaxations on secret police and censorship, as well as more open interactions and trade with the West. Crucially, he also legalized opposing political parties, which had been banned in 1948. These reforms, which he dubbed Socialism with a Human Face, were implemented in April 1968 and gave hope to the populace. However, these prospects threatened Brezhnev, who in August that year proclaimed the Brezhnev Doctrine, in which he swore to prevent the defection of any communist countries, even at the cost of another world war. He also declared that all socialist countries had an utmost duty to protect socialism, which was evidently aimed at the new policies in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was of special importance to the USSR, not only because of its part in trade and industry, but also because of its geography as a border of the USSR. If it were to defect, it would not only split the Eastern Bloc in two, perhaps fueling revolutions in other countries, but also expose the USSR to Western borders, which would be disastrous in the case of a war against NATO. At 11 p.m. on the 20th of August 1968, a Soviet plane arrived at Ruzyně International Airport under the premise of an engine failure. However, from it disembarked more than 100 Soviet agents, including 52 KGB members, who quickly took the control tower and diverted further civilian flights to ease the landing of more troops. Simultaneously, 2,000 tanks and 500,000 soldiers, primarily from the USSR, but also from 3 other Warsaw Pact nations, Poland, Hungary and Bulgaria, also began making their way to Czechoslovakia. East Germany was removed from the operation just a few hours before it began, out of fear of reminding the Czechoslovaks of their Nazi occupation, and Romania and Albania refused to participate. Albania would later leave the Warsaw Pact in protest of these actions. Citizens in Prague awoke the following morning to find their city occupied by Soviet tanks. The sheer speed of the invasion stunned even the Czechoslovak government, but the army was not sent in out of fear that they would join the revolution, as had been the case in Hungary 12 years prior. However, despite the lack of armed resistance, the people of Prague protested nonetheless. Although this had elements of violence, with the most extreme demonstrators throwing petrol bombs on the invading tanks. Many simply shouted at the troops, or even handed out flowers in what came to be known as the peaceful resistance. One of the most dramatic forms of protest, however, was self-immolation, performed in at least 2 independent cases. In Poland, political activist Ryszard Stiewicz, disgusted by his government's communist rule and especially its participation in the Czechoslovak invasion, set himself on fire after a political speech on 8th of September 1968. Tragically, his act was immediately silenced by the secret police and brushed off as a smoking accident. More famously, however, on the 16th of January 1969, 20-year-old student Jan Palach also sacrificed his body to flames in Wenceslas Square, Prague, demonstrating against both the invasion and the ultimate fate of the Prague Spring reforms. In spite of this, the Soviet army quickly overcame the resistance and arrested Dubček and the Central Committee, transported them to Moscow, and took control of Prague. The Central Committee was interrogated by the KGB and then was returned to office on the condition that they revert the anti-Soviet reforms. Censorship was reinstated, as well as the re-banning of all other political parties, which caused suppressed outrage among the Czechoslovaks. Dubček resigned in April 1969 and was replaced by pro-Soviet Gustav Husak, who began a period of normalization, including purging the government of liberal politicians and opponents of the regime. Tragically, the invasion saw limited outside intervention, partly due to the fear of worsening relations with the USSR, but also due to the USA's pressing focus on the Vietnam War. Despite protests in other countries, following the events of the Prague Spring, there were no other uprisings against the USSR until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Ultimately, the crippling defeat in Czechoslovakia served to fasten the Soviet Union's grasp on its satellite states, nearly for good.